Hello, friends, and welcome back to Breaking Bread for You, with a particular welcome to my loyal subscribers who've stayed with me throughout 2018. It has been my hope that in examining the biblical accounts together, that you would come to know more about the true God of creation, His teachings, and how to apply them to your lives. Now, in this video, we are going to examine an episode in the life of the patriarch Abraham from Genesis chapter 22, the only man to have ever been called the friend of God by a Bible writer, the prophet Isaiah, Isaiah 41:8. This story, which can be considered the centerpiece of the book of Genesis, is referred to as the binding of Isaac, or the Akedah in Hebrew. The story begins with Abraham, whose name means father of multitudes, being told by God to go and sacrifice his only beloved son, Isaac. Two questions most often raised about this episode are, why would God ask Abraham to do such a thing? And why would Abraham agree to do it? Before the birth of Isaac, Abraham and Sarah most likely suffered from disgrace and shame, for in that culture to be barren was to be cursed, and to not have anyone to carry on the family name was a major failure beyond what we can understand from our cultural viewpoint. So for Abraham and Sarah to finally have had a son, not only was the shame lifted, but it was a cause for pride on a huge scale. So to have sacrificed Isaac would have brought them back into the shameful state they endured throughout their long marriage, which would have been further exasperated by the loss of a child, the only son whom they loved. Furthermore, Abraham would be forfeiting his legacy, for through Isaac, Jacob would be born, the progenitor of the 12 tribes of Israel, which would be the fulfillment of the promise God made to Abraham that he would be the father of countless peoples. Now, to answer why God would ask such a thing of Abraham and why Abraham would agree to it, we must examine the passage with objectivity, ask pertinent questions, and engage with the cultural norms of Abraham's life, from which we can expect to arrive at the answers. So let's begin by examining what the scriptures tell us about Abraham and his wife Sarah, the story of which spans from Genesis chapters 12 through 26. In chapter 17, we are told that Elohim, and that is Hebrew for God, promises Abraham at the age of 90 that he and Sarah would have a son, in spite of being well beyond the years of procreation, verses 16 through 19. However, being impatient for the child of the promise, Sarah tells Abraham to take her Egyptian servant Hagar as a surrogate to produce a son. And so he did, and Hagar conceived and delivered a boy, who was named Ishmael, meaning God hears, chapters Genesis 16:11 through 16. Yet when Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90, miraculously she conceived and gave birth to a son whom they named Isaac. 21:1 through 3. Then the unthinkable happened, and I quote from the King James Version, Genesis 22, starting in verse 1. And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt, that is, test Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham. And he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I will tell thee of. Now, the text indicates that Moriah is a land of mountains, not a specific mountain, that traditionally has been taken to be Mount Zion in Jerusalem, although Mount Zion is not indicated in Genesis 22. The problem with the Akedah having taken place in Jerusalem is that at the time of Abraham and up to the time of David's conquest of the city 1,000 years later, Jerusalem was originally Jebus, the city of the Jebusites, which would not have been a likely setting to sacrifice a child. A better option for where God sent Abraham would be in the region of Samaria, where the Amorites, or the Amori in Hebrew, the descendants of Ham, had very early on settled in Canaan. We are told in Genesis 12, and I quote, "And Abraham passed through the land unto the place of Sychem, in the region of Samaria, unto the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was then in the land." Given the closeness of the spelling of the Hebrew names Moriah, Amori, and Moreh, indicates that this northern location was the likely setting of the story of the Akedah. The hill of Moreh, as seen in this frame, with the plain of Moreh in the foreground, is where Abraham passed through on his way to Bethel, recorded in Genesis 12. So it might be that Eretz HaMoriah, the land of Moriah, is a misspelling of Eretz HaMoriah, the land of the Amorites or Amori. The Septuagint tells us that God instructed Abraham to go to the highland, which is in the central and northern regions of Israel, as opposed to the southern area of Jerusalem. The hill of Moreh would certainly be a more likely place for the sacrifice of Isaac, particularly when it mentions in Genesis 12:6 that the Canaanites dwelt there, who were known to have practiced child sacrifice. However, the Mount Zion location for the Akedah is preferred by Jews because it serves as a foreshadowing of the temple and the sacrificial system. For Christians, the Jerusalem setting of the Akedah is a foreshadowing of the crucifixion of Christ, in spite of not having happened on Mount Zion, but either on Golgotha, which I take to be the case, or at the place of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So why is scrutinizing the text as such so important? My answer to that is that in general, being in the habit of discovering the truth will yield a greater understanding of what the authors wanted us to know in order to best apply those truths to our lives. Now, where the Akedah took place does not have any bearing on the message of the story, or not much of it anyways, but in digging for the truth in other verses, it might result in discovering a truth that could alter traditional interpretations of the story, thereby advancing biblical study, not to mention providing the right application for us, which, by the way, is the purpose for studying the scriptures. So getting back to the text in verse 3, it reads, "And Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his ass, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went up unto the place of which God had told him." Now, many of you are wondering, why would Abraham not have questioned God over this, as he had over the Sodom and Gomorrah debacle in the attempt to save his cousin Lot in Genesis 18? Now, there is a plausible answer to this, so keep this question in mind as we begin to discover what it is. And returning to the text, we read in verse 4, "Then on the 3rd day Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said unto his young men, Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and come again to you." Therefore, to leave the servants behind seems to indicate that at this point Abraham intended to sacrifice Isaac and wanting to carry it out privately. However, this cannot be the case based on what Abraham told the lads, unless he was lying. That is, "And we will come again to you," which in the Hebrew is venashuvah, the first person plural future tense of the verb shuv, to return, indicating that both father and son would return. Based on this, we can say that Abraham was committed to obeying God's command to sacrifice Isaac, while hoping that Yehovah would call it off and that they would all be returning home. Verse 6 reads, "And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and they went both of them together. And Isaac spoke unto Abraham his father, and said, "My father." And he said, "Here am I." "My son." And he said, "Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering." So they went both of them together. So it is to wonder if this was wishful thinking on Abraham's part, or was he trying to keep what he was about to do from Isaac? I take it that it was neither, but that it was a matter of pure faith on Abraham's part, always believing that God would somehow provide a substitution for Isaac. Now, here we come to the climax of the story, and I quote from verse 9. "And they came to the place which God had told him of, and Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven, and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fear God, seeing that hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me." Now, we understood from the beginning, back in verse 1, that Abraham was being tested. But it is in verse 12 that we learn what he is being tested for, that Jehovah was testing him to see if he revered him more than he loved Isaac, with the emphasis being from verse 1 that this was his only beloved son. And now comes what may be the second climax to the second conflict of the story. What is Abraham going to sacrifice instead of Isaac? And I quote from verses 13 and 14 where it says, "And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by the horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah Yireh, as it is said to this day, In the mount of the Lord it shall be seen," or provided for. And then comes the reward. In verse 15, it says, "And the angel of the Lord called unto Abraham out of heaven the second time, and said, By myself have I sworn, saith the Lord, for because thou hast done this thing, and have not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore. And thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice." This was a renewal of the unconditional promises made to Abraham in chapters 12, 13, and 15. Except in this case, it was due to his obeying God's command to do the worst thing anyone could ask of him, sacrifice his only beloved son. Now, I take it that the ram caught in the thicket episode served ancient Israel as a prohibition against child sacrifice, perhaps during the reforms of King Josiah, during which time he had destroyed the shrines where topheths, that is, ovens, were established for child sacrifice. We know that child sacrifice was practiced in ancient Israel by the Israelites, evidenced in the writings of the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and by the writer of the 106th Psalm. In the book of 2 Kings, it is recognized that child sacrifice was the cause of Jehovah unleashing the Babylonians and their allies to assault Judah, destroy Jerusalem and the temple, and to deport the Jews to Mesopotamia. 2 Kings 24, 1-4. Now, we are told at the end of the story in verse 19 that Abraham returns to his servants without mention of Isaac, from which some have speculated that Abraham had actually sacrificed his son in an earlier version of the story. Yet, in the following accounts, Isaac is married off to Rebekah, who bears him a set of twins, Jacob and Esau, and even before, in Genesis 22, in verses 20 through 24, we have the genealogy of Rebekah. And so the promises of Jehovah to Abraham and Sarah are fulfilled. But let's look at the reason Abraham would have agreed to do such a thing in the first place, without any apparent hesitation, not even questioning God as he had over Sodom and Gomorrah. And in order to answer that, we need to take a look at the culture in which Abraham was born and bred, the city of Ur of Sumer, present-day southern Iraq. Now, the people of Sumer were highly cultivated, skilled in, to name a few disciplines, mathematics, natural science, medicine, astronomy, and language, having the first written language. We know this from clay tablets inscribed with Sumerian cuneiform writing that had been uncovered by archaeologists in Iraq that are dated to 3100 BC, and so far being the oldest record of written language. Now, Abraham was born around the year 2000, although others offer a later date of 1800 BC. Whatever the case, Abraham and his father Terah lived in what was a dark age in Mesopotamia, when Sumer was conquered and dominated by the Akkadians, with the exception of 100 years between 2100 to 2000 BC. So, under the threat of Akkadian dominance, Terah would have had good reason to leave Mesopotamia with his clan for the land of Canaan, Genesis 11:31. However, they only got as far as Haran in the northern territory of Mesopotamia, where the culture would have been enough like Ur in Sumer. Perhaps after a long journey, Haran might have appeared to be the right place to settle, being a prosperous city of trade and commerce. However, after Terah died when Abram was 75 years old, Jehovah instructed him to leave Haran and everything else in his life behind. And I quote, "Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee." Chapters 12:1. Clearly, Jehovah's plan was to separate Abraham from those who belonged to the beliefs and practices of Sumerian religion. Now, to give you an idea of what Abraham worshipped before he encountered and began to follow Jehovah, the Sumerian religion was polytheistic, having many more than one gods, in which 7 main deities were venerated, and they are as follows: Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Nana, Utu, and Inanna, not to mention some 3,000 other minor gods. To tell you a bit about them, Anu was the supreme god, the god of the heaven and the creator of the world, with all other deities being his offspring, born to his consort Ki, by which they were called Anunnaki. Then there was Enlil, a fatherly, benevolent god who cared about the well-being of humans, understandably becoming the chief of the Sumerian pantheon. Enki, the god of fertility and knowledge, creator of mankind, involved in human culture, had a consort, the earth goddess Ninhursag. Like the Greco-Roman goddess Venus, Inanna was the goddess of love, sexuality, prostitution, and war. And finally, there was Utu, the Sumerian sun god, dispenser of justice, protector of the righteous, and punisher of the wicked. The god of Abram's city, Ur, was Nana, the moon god, who pronounced the fate of the dead. Interestingly, some of Sumerian mythology parallels the stories of the Hebrew Bible, namely that of creation, the Garden of Eden, the Tower of Babel, and the Great Flood. Also, the Sumerian heaven and Sheol are similar to those of Judaism. Now, in the 17th century BC, when Babylon gained dominance in Mesopotamia, Baal Marduk was introduced as the highest deity, and Inanna morphed into the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, or Asherah as she was called in Israel, the wife of Baal-Marduk, the mother of all deities. The worship of Asherah had been adopted by the Canaanites, who sacrificed children to her, and the god Molech, as was later practiced by the Israelites from the time of King Solomon in the 11th century BC to the Babylonian deportations in the 6th century BC. Now, in regard to Abraham's acceptance of Jehovah's command to sacrifice Isaac, it might have been the case because he was born in a culture where ritual human sacrifice was practiced. 2 decades ago, Dr. Janet Mung, a physical anthropologist from Penn State University, examined CT scans of skull bones of 2 individuals, a man and a woman, taken from an excavation in what was the cemetery, the royal cemetery of Ur of Sumer, first dug by English archaeologist C. Leonard Woolley in the early 20th century. Altogether, over 500 bodies have been unearthed bearing evidence of ritual sacrifice. Dr. Mung determined that the 2 individuals had been killed by blunt force trauma to the head, caused by thrusting a sharp instrument into their skulls, known to be a means of ritual sacrifice at that time and place. These corpses were buried in royal attire and adorned with precious jewelry, in accordance with the practice of sacrificing royal servants at the time of the death of the king, in order that he would be served in the afterlife by them. So it would have been considered as an honor to have been sacrificed for such a time, as the servants would have been led to believe anyways, especially as it would have been a guarantee of going to Sumerian heaven. So, to answer why Abraham did not question Jehovah's command to sacrifice Isaac, let me say that it would not have benefited the story of the Akedah in the first place, as was the case with Sodom and Gomorrah episode, since God never intended that the sacrifice of Isaac be carried out, as he had with the destruction of those 2 wicked cities. So in answering why Abraham did not argue with God, let me offer 2 possibilities, with the first being that Abraham either loved and or feared Jehovah so much more than he loved his son Isaac and the promise of his legacy. The second and more likely answer is that due to the culture from which Abraham came, where human sacrifice was practiced, he understood that sacrificing his son and offering him up to Jehovah was the righteous thing to do, in the sense of giving his son back to the God who gave him to him in the first place. And if the promise of being the father of many nations was going to be fulfilled, Abraham might have trusted Jehovah to provide yet another son through whom the bloodline would be continued. And in establishing how the Akedah was meant to function, or what the writer wanted us to learn from this story, 3 answers have emerged. The first one is that Abraham, and even Isaac, who appears to have been willing to be sacrificed, function as exemplars of radical obedience to God's commands. Certainly, what we learn from this story is that whatever or whomever we should love in this world, nothing is as important as Almighty God, as revering Him and obeying His commandments. Similarly, what we learn from this story is that obedience trumps sacrifice. Remember, Jehovah never really wanted Abraham to sacrifice his son, but wanted Abraham to sacrifice his will, to obey his command, even at the expense of losing what he trusted in or treasured in the most. As we learn from the prophet Samuel, who said, and I quote, "As the Lord is great a delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, as in obedience to the voice of the Lord. Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams." 1 Samuel 15:22. And thirdly, The function of the Akedah is recognized in the episode of the sacrificial substitution of the ram, the foreshadowing of Israel's Messiah, represented by the ram, the male Lamb of God, who through his blood sacrifice would pay for the sin of the world. This is so well alluded to in Abraham's response to Isaac when he said, God himself will provide the lamb. And we know that God himself, in the person of Jesus, his only begotten Son, became the sacrificial lamb that paid for the sin of the world. Certainly, the image of Isaac climbing to the place of sacrifice with wood on his back is a picture of Jesus carrying the crossbar to the place of his crucifixion. And the emphasis of Isaac being Abraham's only beloved son most certainly points to Jesus, the Messiah, who, as the apostles John and Matthew wrote, Jesus is God's only begotten and beloved Son. John 3:16 and Matthew 3:17. So we can say that the story of the near sacrifice of Isaac functions as a bridge spanning from Genesis 22, bypassing the historical books that expose the wickedness and apostasy of ancient Israel and their dire need of forgiveness and redemption, through the writings and prophets who predicted the advent of Christ, to the Gospels of Jesus Christ, from whom Jews and Gentiles alike can receive all of that through God's Son, Yeshua HaMashiach. Now, how do we apply all of this to our lives? Let me suggest that while you are sacrificially giving to the Lord through the study of His Word, volunteering in ministry, financially supporting ministry, helping those around you, fasting, praying, and worshiping God, all of which we should do as children of God. But remember what Christ expects of you, and that is to follow Him by obeying His commandments. For instance, forgive wrongs done, love your enemies, turn the other cheek, and do good to those who hate you, always remembering what Samuel wrote, to obey is better than sacrifice. Secondly, as human beings, we fail through pridefulness, prideful of who we are, what we look like, what we acquire, and who we give birth to and raise. And always bear in mind that whatever you have in this world that you pride will eventually leave you. Whether that be spouses or children, careers, health and wealth, it will at some point be removed from your life. And then you will be standing before Almighty God to give an account for your life. Whether you obeyed God's call and direction, whether obeying His commandments were more important to you than anything else that the world has to offer. If you are going to take pride in anything, let it be in Jesus Christ and what He sacrificed for you, that you would be forgiven and that you would spend eternity with Him. Thank you for viewing this presentation, and may Jehovah bless you all richly in your walk with Him. I pray for you, and especially for my subscribers, that this year will bring wonderful encounters with the Lord, and that you will grow in leaps and bounds in Him, being blessed in body, mind, and spirit. Please subscribe to my channel and hit that bell in order to receive notification of my next video. Also, if you choose, visit Jan Curcio YouTube channel to view my other videos.